All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling a huge topic, how the European Union actually makes its laws. You know, it's one of the most complex political systems on the planet, but we're going to decode it together.
I mean, think about it for a second. How do you get 27 different countries to agree on a single rule for over 400 million people? It sounds kind of impossible, doesn't it? But believe it or not, it happens all the time. So let's follow the incredible journey of a European law from just a tiny idea all the way to a rule that affects us all.
Okay, so where does it all begin? Well, our journey starts in a place you might not expect. It's not with the big-name politicians or presidents. Nope. It all starts with a very unique institution right at the heart of the EU, and this place holds a really special power.
And that institution is the European Commission. The best way to think about the Commission is like the architect of EU law. They're the only ones with what's called the right of initiative, a fancy term for saying they're the only ones who can actually draw up the blueprints for new laws. Their whole job is to spot problems that stretch across borders and then come up with a proposal to solve them. And they're meant to do this independently, looking out for the interests of the entire EU.
But, hold on, the Commission can't just wake up one morning and decide to write any law it feels like. No way. Before a single word of a proposal is even drafted, the idea has to survive this really rigorous process called the policy cycle. It's all about making sure that every proposal is actually necessary and has been properly thought through.
And this cycle has 5 key stages. First, you've got agenda setting. That's just identifying the problem. Then policy formulation, where they figure out the options and draft a plan. After that comes the decision-making, implementation, and finally evaluation way down the line to see if it even worked. The whole point of this is to make sure every law is based on solid, real-world evidence.
So once the Commission has its blueprint ready, that's the official legislative proposal, it's time to hand it off. And this is where things get really interesting, because the proposal goes to the 2 main decision-makers in a pretty fascinating power-sharing setup. Here's the deal. For any law to pass, it has to get the green light from 2 different bodies, representing 2 totally different sets of interests. On one side, you have the European Parliament. Think of them as the voice of the people. You know, the members are directly elected by us. On the other side, you have the Council of the EU, and they represent the national governments. So you've got the people's voice and the country's voice, and both have to agree. Now, this is super important, and it trips a lot of people up. Don't get the councils mixed up. They sound the same, but they're totally different. The Council of the EU, that's the one we just talked about, is where national ministers, like environment ministers or finance ministers, get together to actually vote on laws. But then there's the European Council. That's the summit of the big bosses, all the presidents and prime ministers. They set the overall political direction, the grand strategy, but they don't get into the nitty-gritty of writing the laws themselves.
Okay, so we've met the players. How do they actually work together to make a law? This brings us to the absolute core of the process, what's known as the ordinary legislative procedure. Get ready because this is the negotiation gauntlet. This is where the real work of hammering out a deal actually happens.
You can almost picture it like a game of legislative ping-pong. The proposal gets batted back and forth between the Parliament and the Council. Each side takes a swing, adding their own amendments and making changes. They keep going until, and this is key, they can agree on the exact same text. This process can go for a first reading, a second reading, and if they're still stuck, a final conciliation phase. But if they can't find that common ground after all that, well, the law just fails.
But here's a little inside baseball for you, the real secret to how anything gets done. To avoid getting bogged down in those formal readings forever, the 3 institutions, the Commission, Council, and Parliament, get together for these informal, behind-the-scenes negotiations called trilogues. Now, this is where the real horse trading happens and compromises are found. It's super efficient, but it also gets some flack for not being very transparent, since it all happens behind closed doors.
And if you want proof of how important these trilogues are, just look at this number. Around 90%, that's right, 90, of all EU laws are actually agreed upon during the very first reading. That is just staggering. And it's all thanks to these informal negotiations that smooth out the bumps and prevent gridlock before it even starts. So getting a law through all of that is a huge deal, a major achievement. But it's not the finish line, not even close. Now comes the next massive challenge. How do you make this one law actually work on the ground in 27 different countries, each with its own legal system?
Well, the EU basically has 2 main tools in its toolbox for this. The first is a regulation. Think of this as a one-size-fits-all federal law. The moment it's passed,
Boom, it's the law everywhere in the EU, just as it's written. The second tool is a directive, and this one's a lot more flexible. A directive sets a common goal that everyone has to reach, but it leaves it up to each individual country to figure out how to tweak their own national laws to get there.
And here's where our journey comes full circle, right back to where we started, with the European Commission. After kicking the whole thing off by proposing the law, it now puts on a new hat. It becomes the guardian of the treaties, basically the referee. Its job is to monitor all 27 countries and make sure everyone is applying the new rules correctly and fairly. If a country doesn't comply, the Commission can even take them to court.
So this all leads to a really fundamental question, right? You hear about the EU making laws on fishing quotas or trade deals, but why can't it make laws about, say, your income tax or your national healthcare system? Who gets to decide what the EU has power over and what it doesn't?
The answer to that is buried in the EU's founding treaties. You can think of these treaties as the EU's constitution or its ultimate rulebook. They spell out in black and white exactly where the EU can make laws and where the power stays with the national governments. And they do this by dividing all powers, or competences as they call them, into three main buckets.
Okay, so here are the three types of power. First, you have exclusive competence. In these areas, like the customs union, only the EU can make laws, period. Then there's shared competence. Here, both the EU and the member states can pass laws, but, and this is a big but, if there's a conflict, EU law wins out. This covers a lot of ground, like environmental protection. And finally, you have supporting competence. In areas like tourism or culture, the EU can't write the rules. It can only support, coordinate, or supplement what the individual countries are doing.
And there's one final guiding principle that underpins this whole system. It's called the principle of subsidiarity. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually super simple. Decisions should always be made as close to the citizen as possible. The EU should only step in and act if it's completely clear that a goal can't be achieved by countries acting on their own.
So there you have it. From that first spark of an idea inside the Commission, through that intense negotiation gauntlet between the Parliament and a Council, all the way to becoming a law that impacts over 400 million people, the journey is, well, it's incredibly complex. It's a system that is fundamentally built for compromise, a constant delicate balancing act between 27 different national interests and the push for united action. And the big question is this unique and complex system truly built to last?